So last time we were looking at the narrative of the rise of, or the survival, I should say, of the Davidic kingdom, and ultimately the question of whether or not the promise that God made to David in 2 Samuel 7 will finally be fulfilled. And the narrative is very subtle. It gives you an honest portrayal of what human beings might do in this sort of situation. It has a very realistic feel to it, and it borders on the very edge of tragedy. It is not clear that David has succeeded in being able to have the promise pass on to a future generation. The story is full of the death of people around David, including members of his own household. And so the narrator keeps us in suspense till the very end, when, among others, Joab and a few faithful courtiers manage to drag David kicking and screaming into doing what he needs to do as king in order to maintain his throne. It's a gripping portrayal of the events that took place from a very human perspective. After that happens, though, the throne will eventually pass to Solomon. So the answer to the question is, will a Davidite sit on the throne in Jerusalem? And the answer will finally be yes, but even that is not completely clean. The narrative, when we move over into 1 Kings, the beginning of 1 Kings, is full of the same sort of palace intrigue that we saw in the preceding narrative, but it has now been overlaid and greatly expanded by a kind of Deuteronomic effort at elevating Solomon, quite literally, to a status which David himself did not really achieve, namely the status of a genuine Oriental monarch, someone who has complete control and a huge empire. Now, the archaeologists will be the first to tell you that there is not an awful lot of evidence for this huge Solomonic empire. We won't go into that right now. But you should notice that the narrative itself, the way that Israel remembers its own history, does include this section on the exaltation of Solomon. And you know the various pieces of that, predominantly his probably fantastic reputation for wisdom and being wise. He will be credited with the authorship later on of some of the wisdom books in our text. You'll deal with those next semester, including one called The Wisdom of Solomon, which you can read and never know that it was by Solomon. But he has the reputation for doing things of this sort. He will also be credited with writing some of the other wisdom books. The book of Kohelet is said to traditionally to have been written by Solomon, and so on. Song of Songs is said to have been written by Solomon, thereby raising the puzzle of how two such different books could be written by the same person. And the rabbis, of course, have a ready answer to that he wrote Song of Songs in the exuberance of his youth, and then when he became a bitter old man, he wrote Kohelet about how all wisdom is futile, and so on, which is a good humanistic kind of explanation for how one person can produce lots of different kinds of things. So Solomon will be credited with the building of the temple and much of the first part of 1 Kings, in addition to the stories about the aggrandizement of Solomon and stories about his wisdom, will treat you in excruciating detail to the way in which the temple was actually built. It is built, interestingly, by Phoenician craftspeople. Apparently the standard temple patterns, because they required wood for monumental building, mostly came from the Lebanon, where the tall trees still grow. There is no tree big enough further south that you can do monumental building with it. So the Phoenicians become the experts in temple building because they have the materials ready to hand. And so Hiram of Tyre is said to have been the consultant, let's say, on the temple, and to have made deals with Solomon about the supplying of materials. It's interesting that Tyre also supplies the architectural plans, designs the vestments for the priests, and decorates the temple according to a Tyrian pattern. Just in case you get sucked in by all of this, you should begin to notice that the Solomon story, as the Deuteronomistic historian tells it, is full of warnings about the reign of Solomon. Solomon is successfully king, and therefore he represents God's fidelity to the promise made to the Davidic house, but Solomon does not come to this with clean hands any more than David did. And you need to be alert as you read that material to the portrait of Solomon, which is the undercurrent of the narrative. And we get it right away. The book of Kings opens after David has successfully secured his throne and more or less been given peace from his enemies, at least temporarily. At the end of Samuel, when we get into 1 Kings, David is now on his deathbed. And it will be in that condition in chapter 1 that we see him taken advantage of as an old man who does not really fully know or understand what is going on, when Bathsheba comes to him and reminds him of promises that he never made about who his successor will be. And so Solomon's reign begins on this note of harem intrigue, in which the wives of David are vying to have their children succeed him. And so in that sense, it is a very traditional story. Miraculously, David, on his deathbed in chapter 1, seems to come back to life in chapter 2, which is the real beginning of the Solomon story. And if I had to guess about its origin, I would guess that this is a story that Solomon himself probably told to justify what, in fact, is going to mark the beginning of his reign, which is a thoroughgoing purge of everyone who opposed him. And so it will be interesting that whereas David and Saul were anointed by prophets, thus indicating that they were divinely chosen, there is no narrative here of a prophetic choice of Solomon. Solomon comes to power because he decides to come to power. And he more or less installs himself as king before anybody else notices that it has been done. So the whole reign begins in a somewhat odd way. In the meantime, in chapter 2, David has a kind of Godfather moment. This is the place where we would expect, given stories about Moses and Samuel, we would expect the traditional farewell speech by the central character, in this case, David. And indeed, David does not disappoint us. He summarizes Deuteronomic theology for us at the very beginning, and it sounds as if we are back in the world of the Deuteronomist again. The theology now is going to be much more thoroughly Deuteronomistic than it has been in the stories about the succession to David's throne. So we're now in a different kind of literature. But notice the advice that David gives to Solomon, and it fits right into your latest Godfather movie. My son, there are things that I could not do, but now I ask you to do them. You will have to do these things that I was not able to do. And here comes the hit list of all of the people that David is angry at, even though we have no backstory at all for what David is talking about. And where he got this, we do not know. My guess is that this is just as David, when he was taking over from Saul and killed most of the Saulites, David tried to cover it up by saying that it was not he who did this, but someone else who misunderstood what he was telling them to do. And in this case as well, my guess is that this is Solomonic material, which is designed to cover up what Solomon finally does to secure his empire. So Solomon's empire begins in a way, in a very typical pattern that looks as if things are going well. And if you get sucked in by the narrative of all the wonderful things that he built and all the wisdom that he had and so on, we need to notice how the story of Solomon finally ends in chapter 11. And it will be a thorough kind of Deuteronomistic ending, which is somewhat puzzling because many of the things that Solomon did and was allowed to get, and not allowed to get away with, are the same things that David did and was allowed to get away with. And comparing these two kings and the way they are treated in the narrative is a very interesting exercise to see why the narrator does not comment on what David does so much as what Solomon does. And so it will be Solomon at whose doorstep the destruction of the Davidic Empire is finally laid, not to David himself, which is an interesting twist that the narrative takes, and the writers of Kings will continue that all the way along. But we begin to see the downward slope clearly, finally, in chapter 11, with the opening remarks, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh." We've already been introduced to the daughter of Pharaoh. "There were Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites and Sidonians and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites, 'You shall not enter into marriage with them.'" Here we are quoting Deuteronomy again, right? Marrying into the families of the inhabitants of the land. Why is that a problem for Deuteronomy? Because it is going to lead to the worship of the local gods. And that's the one thing Deuteronomy cannot tolerate. And sure enough, when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Now you have to think a little about David's love life at this point. David, where the Deuteronomist is getting this story, I do not know about David, because David doesn't really qualify either, for all sorts of reasons that we've already looked at. So Solomon followed Ashtarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This is the first explicit judgment on a king in the Deuteronomistic history. And all of the kings, north and south, are going to be subject to this kind of judgment. And Solomon, usually the southern kings get a pass on this because of David, but Solomon is the first king who is said by the historian to have done what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it's always because they worship the other deities. So Solomon's empire finally goes down for the same reason, if you are an alert reader, that the northern kingdom in its entirety is going to go down. And eventually, most of the Judean kings will also go down, with a very few exceptions. And we'll see in a minute how the historian tries to work all of this out. And so, just as in the period of the judges, you remember the Deuteronomistic pattern of the period of the judges, when the people go off and worship other deities, then God raises up an adversary for them and the adversary oppresses them for a certain number of years, and the people cry out to Yahweh, and in good Deuteronomistic fashion, when they cry out to Yahweh, Yahweh sends a judge to come and take care of the oppressor. This is the same pattern. And so in chapter 11, verse 14, Yahweh raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the royal house of Edom, and on we get the backstory of all of this. And 23, God raised up another adversary against Solomon, Ratzon, the son of Elidah, who had fled from his master, King Hadadezer, and so on. And so it doesn't take very long for the pattern of the judges now to be repeated with this monarch who is being lifted up as the fullest development of the monarchy based in Jerusalem. But this time it is going to go farther than that in terms of what will happen. Along about verse 26, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zeridah, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, rebelled against the king. And this was the reason he rebelled against the king. He had a good reason to do that. The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. And at that time, when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Achiah the Shilonite, so here is a prophet who is associated with the old Yahweh shrine at Shiloh, which was the place where Samuel held forth before the city was captured by the Philistines and the ark was captured. So he represents an old religious tradition in Israel, which is perhaps the tradition, the Shiloh tradition, lying behind the origins of Deuteronomism. We don't really know all of that, and it would take too long to present an argument for it. But it is Achiah the Shilonite who found him in the road. Now Achiah had clothed himself with a new garment, and when the two of them were alone in the open country, Achiah laid hold of the new garment he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. And then he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I am about to tear the kingdom from the house of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. 1 tribe will remain his." Don't worry about the math. They don't do math well. 10 and 1 does not add up to 12, just so you know that I know that. And I think I can explain to you why they say this, but don't you worry about it. Don't get lost. Just savor the moment. I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. 1 tribe will remain his, and here they have Judah in mind. For the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all my tribes. So 2 Samuel 7 is still good, but now much diminished. God will remain enthroned in Jerusalem, as will a Davidic king, but the empire itself is gone. There now are 2 kingdoms that we need to worry about, and the northern kingdom is by far the larger one. This is all because Solomon has forsaken me and worshipped Ashtarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the Ammonites, and has not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and keeping my statutes and my ordinance as his father David did. This is the first of these positive comparisons of the king with David, or negative with David, depending. But it's always David who is the touchstone, not Solomon. And Solomon now, in the telling of the Deuteronomist, is the one under whose watch the entire operation begins to slide away. And we see the first in a pattern which is going to be repeated over and over again. So the basic outline now of the book of Kings is twofold. They're going to look at both the south and the north and evaluate them mostly on the basis of whether or not they worship other gods, whether or not they walk in the ways that Yahweh has indicated, as David did. So there, in the south, there will also always be a comparison with David. In the north, there will always be a comparison with the first northern king, Jeroboam, known in history speak as Jeroboam the first. There will be a Jeroboam the second as well. None of the northern kings stack up to this. So it doesn't take very long for you to give a quick picture of what the history of the northern and southern kingdoms really is. That basic history is hammered at you at every change of reign in Kings, and each change of reign includes a judgment on the king. And that's important. The focus of the book of Kings is kings, right? So, so-and-so became king, and he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, or he did what was good in the eyes of the Lord. That's what immediately follows that, along with certain other archival data that they seem to be getting from some kind of a king list. When they give you the length of reign, in the case of the South, they give you the name of the Queen Mother, who is an important figure in the South but not in the North, and so on. On and on it goes. That's all you need to remember. You need to remember the sequence of Kings, because that's about all that Deuteronomy is going, or that the book of Kings is going to tell you. Two exceptions. One is that in the middle of the book of Kings is a huge insertion of a lot of old prophetic stories. They're really interesting stories. The most famous ones are the Elisha stories. Those really get covered in this course in the second semester when we do prophecy, because the entire set of narratives has to do with a major prophetic opposition to the rise of the Omrid dynasty in the north. And it is that is the core of both First and Second Kings. So that's mostly what they have to tell you about the northern kingdom in detail. These stories about this prophetic opposition to the Omrids, and that leads ultimately to the Jehu revolt, which successfully overthrows the Omrid line, establishes for the north, a more or less stable monarchy of 5 kings, which shows you that the northern kingdom ultimately is not stable in the same way the south in Judah is stable, and then eradicates the worship of the Tyrian Baal from the northern kingdom and reinstitutes the worship of Yahweh. In spite of all of that, and even though it's a great surprise when you get to it in the narrative, you will discover that Jehu also, even though he did the things that the opposition wanted done, Jehu also did what was evil, although they don't tell you exactly what that might be. It's a kind of letdown after the exaltation of the narrative in the overthrow of the Omrids and the reinstitution of Yahweh worship. But nevertheless, he did what was evil, but not as much as the others. So the historian gives him 5 changes of reign, within his own line, which is better than any of the other northern kings do. What you're seeing here is theological framework coming into a clash with historical reality. There are only a certain number of things you can do with historical reality, and it is what it is, and ultimately the whole operation is going to be taken over by the Assyrians in the north and eventually the Babylonians in the south. So that's the way that's the way the story is going to end, and there's not much you can do about that. So the historian is trying to write you a history that stays within the boundaries of their own theological perspective, but at the same time dealing with historical realities that they really have no control over. You cannot argue that Jerusalem more than once got a pass when the Assyrians came to invade. It happened once. It did not happen again when the Babylonians were there, in spite of the fact that the later prophetic books will over and over cite this miracle that occurred when the Assyrians invaded Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah, and the city was saved miraculously by the deity because of the fidelity of Hezekiah the king. They tried it again with Josiah. That did not work out well. Josiah is killed off by Pharaoh Necho for reasons that are never made clear in the text. It is something of an embarrassment to the historian. That shouldn't have happened to a nice king like Josiah. Nevertheless, that's historical reality again, coming into contact with a theological framework. After that, it's all downhill. They lose interest in the last kings in Jerusalem completely. They lose track of the northern kingdom completely once the Assyrians take it in 722-21, in the final Assyrian capture of the north. And we have more and more archaeological evidence from that period, which is very interesting in the north. There's probably also much more Assyrian presence in the south than our text indicates, but the kings in Jerusalem managed a little bit better to do the politics of having to stay on the throne in the face of an Assyrian presence. So that's the historical reality and how the story will end. We all know how it ends. It ends with the people being deported to Babylon at the end of the siege of Jerusalem, which was a 3-year siege. It finally destroyed the city. The temple itself is burned, and the people in the city are taken off in 2 more deportations. There had already been one, and there were 2 more in which the people were taken off into exile in Babylon, from which they will return in roughly 70 years, as the prophet Jeremiah had prophesied. All right, so that's to carry the story to its end. So how does the Deuteronomistic historian deal with all of this? It looks thoroughly Deuteronomistic. According to the historian, the northern kingdom was ultimately destroyed by the Assyrians as part of God's judgment on Jeroboam. Well, Jeroboam a minute ago, when we were reading the narrative, was just elected king divinely through an oracle of Achiah of Shiloh. So what happened? Well, according to the historian, Jeroboam immediately got himself in trouble. And it it happens not long after the kingdoms divide. In chapter 12, we get the story when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned. He's been fleeing to Egypt because of worries that Solomon might be out to get him. Those are well-placed worries in the case of Solomon. He came back, and they sent and called an assembly, and they made him king over all Israel. Notice in this version of it, it sounds very much like the narratives about the rise of kingship. In this version of it, you have a prophetic choice, but then you have an actual activity on the part of the people that makes Jeroboam king. So Solomon's successor in Judah, Rehoboam, came to Jerusalem, and he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, and so on. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, Say to Rehoboam of Judah, son of Solomon, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, so says Yahweh, you shall not go up or fight against your kindred, the people of Israel. Let everyone go home, for this thing is from me. And so they heeded the word of the Lord and went home again according to the word of the Lord. So there is not a confrontation over the split. And then we get the beginning of Jeroboam's reign in the north. Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. And he went out from there and he built Penuel. And then Jeroboam said to himself, Now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master Rehoboam of Judah. So he's worried about this Deuteronomic business of having only one central sanctuary, which happens to be in the south. And he says if we follow that pattern and let people go down there to worship, then what do we do about northern worship? And what do we do about trying to maintain a kingdom in the north? So it's a purely practical solution that he is going to propose to this. And that is they need places they can go in the north. And so they won't be going off to Jerusalem all the time. So Jeroboam is implicitly accepting the Deuteronomic law that there is only one place, but he's going to create alternative places. Not only that, he is going to set up or revive old cult sanctuaries. So the king took counsel. This is the end of chapter 12. And he made 2 calves of gold. Sound familiar to you? Yeah. That's what the people did and asked Aaron to do for them when they went up, when he was up on the mountain. And so Aaron made these 2 calves of gold, and it became a curse to the Aaronid priestly line thereafter because of what he did with creating these idols. One of the first things prohibited in the Decalogue. You will not make an image of anything to represent the deity. And what do you do with these bulls? It became a sin to Israel in the Mosaic period. It's going to become a sin to Jeroboam and his empire at the beginning of the reign in the north, his reign in the north. And notice what he says, in case you forgot until I mentioned it, the connection with the Exodus. I hope you didn't. What does he say to the people after he builds these bull images? You have gone to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's the same Deuteronomic phrase that you see all over the place in the book of Deuteronomy, reminding the people of the backstory and why it is that God has the right to make these demands. And so he put one at Dan and he put the other at Bethel, the old sanctuary that is associated with Jacob, that where David had his vision, or Jacob rather had his vision, in which God came down and he called the name of the place Beit El, because that's where he saw God, the house of God. And not only did he do that, he appointed a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, just like the festival that is in Judah. So he's got illegitimate festivals going on that are taking place at the wrong sanctuaries. You can just see the hair rising on the neck of the Deuteronomist. And he also offered sacrifices on the altar. Priests or kings in Deuteronomy do not have priestly status. So what's he doing? Giving sacrifices on the altar. And now, yes, David's sons were appointed priests, and they were not Levites. We know that. But David gets away with a lot that other people cannot get away with. So he did that at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And he placed in Bethel priests of the high places that he had made. And he went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that he alone had devised. So he's got an alternative cultic calendar in addition to what is going on there. And you know this is going to end badly, and it does in chapter 13. So in spite of the fact that Jeroboam is presented in the narrative as possibly a legitimate parallel line to what is going on down in Jerusalem, in Judah, it very quickly goes south, quite literally, and he commits these sins against the Deuteronomic site, or the Deuteronomic ideas about how the thing ought to operate. And this is immediately condemned in 1 Kings 13, in this remarkable story of the man of God from Judah, who prophesies the destruction of Bethel by Josiah, a prophecy which is finally fulfilled in 2 Kings 23. We have to wait that long. It's the longest of the prophecy fulfillment passages in Kings. We have to wait that long for the judgment to finally fall against Bethel. And when we get to the story of Josiah's reign and his sending up troops to the north, probably politically to take back Bethel for Jerusalem and Judah, the Assyrians, at least temporarily, being preoccupied with something else during that time, the narrator just luxuriates in his destruction of that shrine at Bethel. And there's an explicit back reference to this prophecy, that this is seen as the fulfillment of the words of the prophet who predicted these things. And we will see these prophecy fulfillment notices throughout the book of Kings. So the great theme of the history of the northern kingdom, as far as the Deuteronomistic historian in Kings is concerned, all of the kings in the north are going to be condemned by the historian for walking in the sins of Jeroboam, and every one of the introductions to the reign of a southern king includes that comparison. He made the people to sin by walking in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. So, by definition, from the standpoint of the historian, there is no such thing as a good northern king. It's just a contradiction in terms. You can't have a good northern king, according to the historian, because the entire operation was tainted from the very beginning because of the worship of Jeroboam I at these shrines that he made for himself. This becomes, in the narrative, a kind of warning for the southern kingdom. It's as if the historian is saying, well, look what happened in the north. People went out and they worshiped other gods. They did this from the beginning. God is not in favor of that. God will destroy you if you do things like that. And sure enough, the story finally ends with the coming of the Assyrians, who destroy Samaria and all of the northern kingdom. The historical reality is that the Assyrians, in fact, took several years to take over the northern kingdom, but they did indeed take it over, and it became a province of the Assyrian Empire. And in 2 Kings 17, if you are still wondering why all this happened and why this history of the north turned out the way that it did, there is a long Deuteronomistic sermon in 2 Kings 17. In the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. He reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. He's much worse than that. And for that reason, King Shalmaneser of Assyria came up against him. Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt. So he gets involved in the power politics that are being played there. And finally, the king of Assyria invaded all of the land, came to Samaria for 3 years. He besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and scattered them across the Assyrian Empire. So that is what comes of worshiping other deities, the writer is telling you. And it serves as a warning to Judah. And if you miss the theological point, the writer goes on for another whole chapter telling you this. This all occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt from the hands of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods. On and on this goes. If you have not gotten any stories, and you really haven't gotten any stories in Kings, of Israelites in the north doing these sorts of things, the writer says, well, they did them secretly. You didn't know about it. But trust me, God knew about it, and this is why the northern kingdom finally fell. There is, of course, a parallel story, and that is the history of the south. And that is the second great theme of the Deuteronomistic history in Kings. Just as the history of the north is a history of sin and ultimately of destruction, so the history of the south is primarily one of promise and faithfulness, culminating in an ideal faithful king. The history seems to have gone through several editions, and the identity of the faithful king changes. There seems to be an edition in the time of Hezekiah, who is said to have been the best of all of the kings up to that point. Never was there a king like Hezekiah, who does everything right, and what he mostly does is tear down the high places and refuse to make an agreement with the Assyrians, at least according to the biblical telling of the story. The Assyrians, not surprisingly, have a different version of this. Their version of it has Hezekiah making a covenant with the Assyrians, but the historian overlooks that, and it's one of these history versus theology problems in the history itself. Later on, it will be Josiah who is said to be the best king. So you've got two best kings almost back to back in the southern history, as the historian tells it. Just as David is the faithful king, so also Jeroboam is the archetype of evil in the history. But the Deuteronomist does not automatically assume that all Judahite kings are righteous like David. The Deuteronomist judges them also in terms of how well they carry out the Deuteronomistic reform program. Still, judgment does not come automatically on kings who fail. Rather, the whole line in Judah is preserved for the sake of David. So the history leads up to the one king who is perfect. You can pay your money and take your choice, either Hezekiah or Josiah, depending on which version of the history you're going to read. The facts of history, as we've said, have a way of destroying the best historical or theological interpretations. After a relatively short reign, Josiah was killed in the battle at Megiddo while he was trying to prevent the Egyptian army from coming to the aid of Assyria, against whom Josiah himself had recently rebelled. It was all downhill after that. The Deuteronomistic reform went out the window. All of the pre-Josianic cultic abuses reappeared in the time of Manasseh, according to the current version of Kings. And not long after this, Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. This was a serious blow to Deuteronomistic theology, putting it mildly. It made a joke out of the history itself. No longer could you say that there was a contrast between the North and the South. Both had clearly been punished, and there was a theological conclusion to be drawn from looking at that. The historians in exile did something quite characteristic. They went back and began to reinterpret their history. They began to reread and to reinterpret what was going on. And there were several things that they retained in the history because of that. One was the covenant theology. The Deuteronomistic theology itself provided an explanation for what had happened. Unlike the historians who had bought into the Jerusalem theology of the eternal dwelling of God in the city and the inviolability of the city, and they then had to explain how it could be that Jerusalem was finally captured by the Babylonians. The Deuteronomists did not have that problem. The answer was very clear, and you've already gotten it. The people had a covenant with Yahweh. They broke the covenant with Yahweh, and as a result, the people were punished by being sent off into exile. So the Deuteronomistic theology, for all of its problems and its simplicity, had an explanation for why things went badly. It may not be a satisfying explanation, but it was there. In exile, they had a different problem now. Did the exile itself and the deserved punishment which came because of the violation of the covenant with Yahweh, did that mean that Yahweh had decisively rejected Israel? And there was a serious theological problem in exile over that issue. There were people, apparently, who thought that the answer was yes, God had decisively rejected Israel. There were others who decided that no, even though it looked improbable and even though the exile was stretching out longer than it ought to have, nevertheless, God had not rejected Israel. And there was hope with repentance in good Deuteronomic style that God would eventually take Israel back. And it is this line of thinking that finally leaves its imprint on the Deuteronomistic history, beginning with the book of Deuteronomy itself. And what they do is to go back and reinterpret the story of Moses' failure to go into the land. And they do this as a response to what is happening to them in exile. So the book of Deuteronomy, as we now have it, has a new understanding and explanation of why Moses does not get to go into the land. If you read the book of Numbers, you will see that it's something of a mystery why Moses does not get to go into the land. It's something to do with bringing water from the rock, which he's already done several times successfully. And this time when he does it, God is angry and says, well, because of this, you won't get to go into the land. Nobody understands that passage, including probably Moses, who didn't figure it out. The explanation now in Deuteronomy is quite different. At the beginning of Deuteronomy now, in chapter 1, 37 and 3, 23 through 28, Moses explains to the people at the beginning of his long sermon that he is being punished for the sins of the people. And the idea of suffering as a redemptive feature begins to enter the narrative. And the people who are in exile reading this now assume that it is because they, in exile, much longer than would be just, they were not the people who sinned. It was their ancestors who sinned, and here they are 60, 70 years into this exile in Babylon, and they are still suffering. It is because they said, like Moses, who did not get to go into the land, we are suffering for our descendants. And this notion of redempting suffering begins to take over the literature. You'll see it in the exilic portions of Isaiah, where it gets to be a major feature. Finally, this has an influence on the way the literature is organized. The book of Deuteronomy, which at one point, whether physically or not, served as a kind of introduction to the Deuteronomistic history, is now detached from it. And it is associated with this new collection of material which comes to be known as the Torah. Deuteronomy will now be the last book of the Torah. And what this means liturgically is huge. When the book of the Torah is now read in the synagogue, it goes from Genesis and creation all the way to the edge of the land in Deuteronomy and back again. The last reading from Deuteronomy is followed by the rereading of the first words of Genesis. The people never get to the land. The cycle simply continues. And this notion of looking forward to a final fulfillment of the promise gets to be deeply embedded in Jewish thought, and in its own way will get taken over into Christian thought about the coming of the Messiah and the Messiah coming again. So this notion of the role that suffering can play in redemption gets to be a major feature that has to do with the way in which these historians are rethinking their literature. And by so doing, not only do they solve their problem of how do we explain why we are here in Babylon and what is going to happen finally to us, and that we do have some hope for the future because God has not rejected us. All of that theological perspective comes out of their engagement in a reinterpretation of their texts, and thereby providing later generations with an example of how interpretation moves on from generation to generation. It meets the present in the context of the interpretations of the past. So we now are part of that past and part of that present. So welcome to the world of Old Testament interpretation.